Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second part of the National Humanities Center's three-part series on teaching war fiction. Tonight we'll be looking at All Quiet on the Western Front. My name is Richard Schramm. I'm the Vice President for Education Programs at the National Humanities Center, and I'll be moderating this evening's session. We have a lot of material to cover tonight, so I'm going to go through my usual introduction rather quickly. This, as I said, is the second installment of a three-part series. Last week we looked at Red Badge of Courage. Tonight we'll be looking at All Quiet on the Western Front, and next week, on February 4th, we'll be looking at the widely taught and very popular novel on the Vietnam War, The Things They Carried. We hope you will join us for that. If you haven't discovered all the resources that America in Class from the National Humanities Center offers, please click into americainclass.org. That will land you on this page, and from this page you can find our webinar schedule and all of the other online resources we offer to help teachers teach American history and literature. Also, take a look at our Pinterest page. There you'll find that we have aggregated a lot of our resources according to topic, and we pulled in resources from other places as well. So I think that'll be a very valuable aid to help you in your teaching. In addition, stay abreast of what's going on at the National Humanities Center for Teachers by checking into our Facebook page. If you do that, you will be alerted to new lessons and new webinars, and you'll be up to date on everything that the Humanities Center has to offer for high school teachers. Now, when our seminar is over this evening tonight, please go back to the All Quiet on the Western Front webpage. There you will find a recording of the program and a PowerPoint, and we invite you to use the PowerPoint in your classes. I think there'll be a lot of valuable slides you'll see tonight that you'll be able to use to enhance your lessons on this widely taught novel. In addition, you will find an evaluation form. We please ask you to fill that out and send it to us. Once we receive that, we will send you a letter that you will be able to present to your local certifying authority to obtain whatever recertification credit your participation in this program warrants. So, how do you participate? Well, our scholar, Patrick Deere, tonight will be lecturing, and he will be stopping from time to time to closely analyze some passages from the texts, and we'll be posing discussion questions, and we hope that you respond to those discussion questions in the chat. I will be bringing that chat into the conversation at appropriate moments throughout the evening. You can respond by putting your cursor in that long a rectangular box at the lower right-hand corner of your screen, typing your response, clicking that chat button, send button to the right. It will appear on the large chat screen above, and as I said, I'll bring that into the conversation as we proceed. But don't wait for us to ask a question. If you have a question, or if you have a comment, or if you have a comment on interpretation or teaching, let us know. Share that with us, please. The golden rule of our webinars is that the more you participate, the better the webinar. So we hope we have a lot of participation this evening. So let us get underway. Our scholar this evening is Patrick Deere. We're very delighted to have him with us. He is an associate professor of English at New York University. He published in 2009 and in paperback in 2015, Culture in Camouflage, War, Empire, and Modern British Literature, and Watch for Surge and Silence, Understanding America's Cultures of War. A topic I think that is extremely pertinent today, so watch for that forthcoming book. Patrick, lead us through All Quiet on the Western Front. It's all yours.
Richard, thanks so much for that introduction, and welcome everybody. I'm really excited to be leading this webinar along with Richard Schramm this evening. Before we get going, I'll just say a couple of things about myself. As you can probably tell, I hope you can all hear me loud and clear. I'm originally from England, and but did my doctoral work in the US, in New York, before teaching at NYU, where I've been since 2002. In an interlude from my graduate studies, I taught high school and middle school myself for several years, and did have the pleasure and the challenge of teaching All Quiet on the Western Front at that time. So it's a pleasure to be working this evening with my colleagues in secondary education. So I just wanted to say that. Okay, so let me just give you a quick overview of what I'm going to work through this evening. And as Richard mentioned, we very much want to make this an interactive experience. So please fire away your, I guess, pun intended, questions as I go along. And I'm very much want to us to talk to each other as fellow teachers, and I'm going to be sharing with you that some of the strategies that I've used in teaching All Quiet on the Western Front, and to address the first point in this current slide, other um, texts from the literature of World War One. The first thing I'm going to do is say a few things about the very powerful and persistent myths of World War One, of the Great War, which Erich Maria Remarque was already pushing against in 1929 when All Quiet was published, as I'm going to say, and it's worth beginning by, I think, in approaching the myths of the war, I would just make the point that coming at this novel shortly after the centenary of the beginning of World War One in Europe in August 1914, which was commemorated worldwide in August 2014. When we're approaching the myths of World War One, and the amazing way that I think Remarque is addressing them, I always try and suggest to my students that our job is not just, it's not to debunk or demystify as if somehow we know better than the generations that uh, on the front lines or on the home front in World War One. It's about grappling in a complex way with the way the war has been remembered and still gets mobilized in different ways today. And I think to my second point, I'm just going to give you some brief background about Remarque's biography, a couple of quick notes about his military service, and then give you some slides with some brief quotations from the critical response, the contemporary response to All Quiet. Then I'm going to move on to my central questions about All Quiet on the Western Front, which I think you'll find if you were lucky enough to participate in last week's session on the Red Badge of Courage, you'll find should resonate, but also counterpoint and contrast with the discussion of that book. And then we're going to really, the main job of business is the critical analysis. And I'm going to focus, I mean, there's so much to talk about in All Quiet on the Western Front, but I'm going to focus on questions of heroism, sacrifice, the persistence of humanity, and also this theme of lostness and loss in the novel that the narrator, Paul Baumer, keeps coming back to, and thinking about how we might understand and teach All Quiet on the Western Front as representing a different kind of lost generation. We tend to associate that with expatriate Americans and maybe Irish writers in Paris in the 1920s, but there are all sorts of lost generations during the earlier 20th century in the wake of World War One. Okay, moving right along. Here are a couple of quotations which I'm not going to dwell on too much. And again, I've got quite a few slides here, which I encourage you, as Richard was saying, to make use of these, adapt them, do as you will in your own teaching. I'll be concentrating on some things and not others. And if there are things you want me to address, just let us know through the chat box. So I just have this great formative quotation from Paul Fussell's The Great War and Modern Memory, which was originally published in 1975. Fussell was a World War II veteran. He was a scholar of 18th century poetry. As a veteran of World War II, really wanted to get away from the war, but 30 years after the end of World War II, he found himself publishing this amazing book about the Great War, which still shapes a lot of our thinking about the book. And I'm very much think it's a fantastic study. You could share passages with your students if you wanted. I'm also going to be pushing back a little bit against Fussell's version of the war, which has to do, as this quotation says, with irony. World War One is the event that plunges the world in an ironic way, and in a way, everyone gets to be a little bit of an ironic modernist after World War One. There's a quote from George Mossey. He's really writing about German literature, and I would say just one simple thing at this point is to remember that All Quiet on the Western Front, an incredible novel, but it's written by someone on the losing side. It's the defeated German nation being, this is where the book is coming from. And it really makes a difference, the perspective of the way history is written, by the victors. I think this is why Remarque is able to give us a really complicated and more nuanced version of the war experience. Because of Germany's position after the war. I'll say more on that anon. This is the first slide that I just want us to focus on briefly. Here we have Samuel Hines, who, like Paul Fussell, is also a World War II veteran, interestingly, a great writer about the literature of World War One. His big scholarly book is called A War Imagined, and then he has this smaller book I pulled this quote from called The Soldier's Tale. Both very readable, very useful if you want more background. But here we have Hines encapsulating the mythic version of World War One, and also really beginning to question it from his own perspective as a critic. So he encapsulates the myth by saying that they tell us that the war wasn't writers like Remarque, but also he's thinking of writers like Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, Virginia Woolf, Ernest Hemingway, of course, many other, Dos Passos, many other American writers and poets, dramatists. They tell us that the war wasn't what the myth says it was, or not entirely. That not all young men went to war in a mood of exalted self-sacrifice, that not all of them suffered endlessly and passively, that they were not all victims, that they did not all fight on the Western Front, that not all of them returned at the war's end bitter and disillusioned. Instead, he argues that when we go back to the literature of World War One, really with an open mind in a complex way, we discover that war literature, like All Quiet on the Western Front, will also tell us about other things. And then he says in the end here, later generations have seized on the myth because it offers a clear and correct moral view of a terrible destructive episode in history. But the men who were there, I mean, come on, Samuel Hines, men, women, and others, the men and women who were there say that it was not that simple. What's interesting about this, I think, is that this is not news to us as readers of All Quiet on the Western Front. I think that the complicating moves that Samuel Hines is making, they're already there in Remarque's 1929 novel. And just as a reminder that, the writers got it, I just have one stanza from Siegfried Sassoon, who I'm sure, you and your students very much familiar with, or will be when you've finished with them. This wonderful poem he wrote in 1919. I think he wrote it in March 1919, but it was published for Remembrance Day, November 1919. Um, Memorial Day, as we call it here, aftermath. Have you forgotten yet? In other words, in a certain sense, there's nothing new under the sun. These great complicating moves that literary critics and teachers like us may make now, looking back, it's there already, and I think in All Quiet on the Western Front. So I've just got a slide here.
If I could just interrupt for 1 second, just to make a point of clarification, could you go back a couple of slides to the Samuel Hines quote? That
Sure.
one right now. The myth of World War I that we'll be pushing against is that the men did go into war with a mood of exalted self-sacrifice, that they did suffer endlessly and passively, that they were victims, that they did all fight on the Western Front, and that they did all return to, at the war's end, bitter and disillusioned. That's the myth we're pushing against, right?
That's exactly right. And actually, if I may, I'm just going to jump a couple to this slide.
Mm-hmm.
This again is another way of thinking about this mythic version of the war, which is just too simple. So again, just this very conventional way of looking at. So if you look at I think I've got, let me use my handy pointer here. If we look at the characters bullet point, so often when we think about World War One, the sort of mythic version in the literature, we tend to focus on the lone alienated consciousness of the frontline soldier rather than groups of soldiers or women on the home front, families. There's the myth of, I mean, when I say myth, there's, as Hines was saying, there's a lot of truth in it, but there's also the myth of lions led by donkeys. In other words, the private soldiers, the ordinary soldiers, the grunts, are all heroic, and all of the officers are stupid and incompetent. The enemy at the rear, as Siegfried Sassoon. And we also tend to focus on Northern European characters rather than Southern European or Eastern or colonial troops, for that matter. This was a global conflict. So, in other words, I think if we just open it up, and you can see just those points I was working there in the characters, you can see how Remarque is already complicating that. So exactly, thanks for that, Richard. That's very helpful. So
yeah, that myth comes down. I think that myth finds its way into the classroom through Hemingway, and I'd like to hear our teachers talk about what kind of Hemingway stories they teach. And this also resonates back to last week with the Red Badge of Courage, because there the focus was not on a group of soldiers. Henry Fleming bounces from regiment to regiment. He connects, he's like a billiard ball. He connects with some soldiers a little bit, and then he goes on to another group of soldiers. And then, of course, looking ahead to next week with the things they carried, that is very much about a group of soldiers. So, yeah, that's interesting, and I'd like if some of our teachers want to chime in here about how this enters their classroom. Again, probably through Hemingway. That would be useful.
Yes.
Let's move ahead.
Yeah, let's move ahead. The other thing I'd throw in there, which is it's one of our very powerful cultural myths. It has to do with, again, this is the myth of the Hemingway-esque combat experience as the proving ground. It's like a crucible for character. It's the testing ground for masculinity. Go off to combat and get inspiration. Well, actually, the lesson of the literature, and especially of All Quiet, and as we know from, the enormous number of cases of PTSD from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the veteran suicide epidemic, actually exposure to combat and trauma is not necessarily ennobling, and very often it silences people instead of so much of the struggle for veterans. And I think we see that really well in All Quiet, though tragically, um, plot spoiler for those of our students who haven't yet read the end of the book. We often encounter this. You know, Paul Bauman never gets to. We'll talk about this later. He never gets to the post-war, but he's intensely worried about what this experience means for his generation. What's it going to be like? Can he even imagine
Mhm.
peacetime and the post-war? So I think, you know, it's amazing the degree. And again, Hemingway is the, perhaps unfairly actually, but there's Hemingway the writer, and then there's the Hemingway-esque. You know, that's
Yeah.
part of this kind of mythic inheritance. But
Yeah, well,
let's
it's
move ahead.
interesting. It's interesting that the three authors we're looking at in this series were not exposed to a great deal of combat. Crane, not at all. Hemingway, brief encounter, and as you will tell us here with Remarque, also a brief encounter. Now, two of our authors. Now, Tim O'Brien did serve for a year in Vietnam, and I don't want to get into talking about how Tim O'Brien reflects upon the war's impact on his generation, because that's a whole other topic that we don't need to cover tonight. But it's interesting that two of our writers, at least, had only kind of a not, one no experience, the other Hemingway, the other Remarque rather, just a brief experience, and then of course Hemingway, whom we mentioned, hardly no combat experience. He was wounded as an ambulance driver.
That's right, exactly. Although you know, one of the fascinating and tragic things about trauma is that it's not a sort of quantitative thing. It may
Mm-hmm.
just take one traumatic episode, and then that shapes a whole life if they
Yeah,
only.
yeah.
Um, uh, anyway, so just to that point, I'm not going to dwell on the chronology, which I is here for you all to make use of. But very interesting. Here's this rather poignant photograph of Remarque with his dog, Wolf, or Wolf, I guess. So if I can just draw your attention to, he's drafted in 1916. So he is not a volunteer in 1914. I think it's just worth reminding students of the difference between then and now. I mean, the difference between the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan is that we now have an all volunteer military, whereas, and the interesting thing is, in World War One, there were these volunteers who, there was a great patriotic rush to enlist, and then the crushing and brutal reality of total warfare in the trenches and in other theatres of war. Um, Remarque was not one of those volunteers. In 1915, 1916, the great European imperial armies had to, they had to bring in a draft, conscription. So Remarque was drafted. He has harsh military training. We see that reflected on in All Quiet on the Western Front. Then he's sent off to the Western Front in June 1917. So his combat experience is confined to June and July of 1917. So he's behind the lines about 6 kilometers, which uh, is, several miles. Uh, but he's subject to shelling. He sees some of the horrors of battle. Um, on the first day of the Third Battle of Ypres, which turned into an epic and brutal battle that went one of many, like the Battle of the Somme the previous year. Uh, it goes on until November. It's multiple battles. It's often referred to as Passchendaele, which really, uh, was a kind of iconic battle, like the Battle of the Somme, for suffering and futility. Um, uh, but he's wounded on the first day of the battle, and then he's sent off to a military hospital. And he's in the military hospital for about a year. He has the good fortune, and we do, because otherwise, if he'd gone back to the front, who knows if he would have survived. but he went back to active duty November 1918, and the armistice is signed on November 11th. So he just escaped redeployment. And All Quiet on the Western Front, it's published in Germany, first in newspapers, in a newspaper in serial form, interestingly enough, like those 19th century novels. He found it hard to find a publisher, interestingly enough. I mean, it's amazing to think now. But Ullstein, one of the biggest publishers in Germany, took a gamble on the novel. Well, within a year in 1929, it had sold 1 million copies in Germany and 250,000 in English translation by A.W. Wien. We're reading the same translation. That's a pretty good translation. He becomes a star. He's intensely ambivalent about his celebrity. You can imagine that a novel like this was pretty rapidly attacked by the people on the right. After the Nazis took power in 1933, Remarque, All Quiet on the Western Front, and his sequel, to All Quiet, were amongst the books burned by the Nazis in 1933. And he basically had to go into exile thereafter. So that's all I wanted to pull out of the biography. And then just a couple of other points. I think this is useful for students just to locate. So here's the Western Front, on which things on the last page of the novel. Paul Baumer is killed, and the official report is that All Quiet in English is on the Western Front. Ypres is here, but it's worth reminding students just how the front stretched all the way across Northern Europe, and that there were fronts in the East, in Russia, in Italy, where Hemingway was wounded, and globally. Without the service of the colonial troops, the Allies would not have been able to, continue fighting. It really was an imperial war in that way. Then,
Patrick, if I could just interrupt you for a moment. We have one point. Jody Hollis asked a question for point of clarification. In 1914, when the war began, Remarque was too young to sign up, right? So he was drafted as soon as he became eligible for the draft at 18, correct?
Right.
Okay.
That's correct.
All right. So, okay. We have another. Yes, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, though, he seems to biographically have been a little bit skeptical, untypical of his generation. But, in many ways, he was a pretty conventional young man. So that's a good key clarification. He couldn't have signed up if he'd wanted in 1914.
Right.
And then he had no choice in 1960.
Right. And among the 3 novels that we're reading in this series, Henry Fleming joins. Our Paul is drafted. And then in Things They Carried, Tim, the narrator, is drafted as well as soon as he's eligible. He's not eligible at 18 because he's got a student deferment, but in 68, when he graduates, bang, they get him. Now, this is a really good question. Rashida Smith has posed this, and I'd like to actually defer this question till the end because I think this is kind of an overarching question, and it has all sorts of implications. Should I introduce this novel as a period piece and/or historical fiction? So when we get to the end here, let's talk about how this might relate to our students today. And then Ryan Bischoff notes that in 1917 can be viewed as an historical turning point for most countries involved in the war because of the collapsing morale, and that is an important thing to note today. For our volunteers for Iraq and Afghanistan comprise only about 0.5 to 1% of the U.S. population. So that's an interesting point to make because the wars we're fighting now don't seem to have generational impact, whereas certainly the Civil War did. World War One did, Vietnam did, because of the draft. There was a draft in the Civil War. I mean, 600,000 Americans died in that war. Obviously, there were vast numbers of people involved. Here in World War One, you had the draft. The Vietnam War, you had the draft. World War Two, they had generational impact. But the current conflicts, because the entire nation does not have literal skin in the game, as everyone did, if your son or daughter or your son then was eligible for the draft, that's the generational impact is different, wouldn't you say?
I would totally agree. I think that's an excellent point from Ryan. If I may address you as Ryan. Um, uh, Absolutely. Although I mean, I did this week with my students here at NYU. I just, in counterpointing, say All Quiet on the Western Front with, I gave them an excerpt from Riverbend, who's an anonymous Iraqi woman blogger, wonderful blog, Baghdad's Burning, readily available online, a little bit of that, her experience living in Baghdad in 2004. And I just asked my students, I think this is a really good teaching question. Well, you can ask it at the beginning or the end. And Rashida, excellent question. I'm looking forward to getting into that. We must come back to that because it's a key question. I just ask my students, well, look, here's Paul Baumer, or here are these characters in Mrs. Dalloway or whatever it is. How old we? I I asked my students, when did when did the war in Afghanistan start? Well, some of them know the answer to that. When did it end? No one knows the answer to that. I mean, the answer was officially December 2014. Um, the Iraq War, when did that start? Well, March 2003. When did that end? Officially November 2011. Okay, so look how long these wars have been. How old? I mean, it's one of those questions you always regret asking. How old were you in 2001 or 2003? I mean, it always makes you feel very old when you get that answer. And then just asking, well, do we live in a war culture? Have you grown up in wartime? The answers you will get from a classroom of students are going to be very different, and there are often fewer degrees of separation, even though, as Ryan pointed out, I think it's 1.6 million men and women in uniform who've often served multiple redeployments. Well, the US population is now 300 million. I mean, veterans will often refer to themselves as the other 1%, kind of riffing off of the Occupy Wall Street slogan about we are the 99%. So it's, on the one hand, it's very different, but maybe that's also one of our own myths. We have the myth of the civilian military divide. But I think just asking our students, well, so you've grown up during wartime. What's your awareness of that? Have you? Some will say no, some will say yes. It's really a wonderful way to frame a conversation. So that's my thought. These are great questions. Please keep them coming.
Well, just
Um,
to wrap up that conversation, Jody Hollis writes, most of my students admit they never even think about our wars. And just a point of clarification, um, what we now call PTSD was called shell shock after World War One or during World War One. Is that fair to say, Patrick?
that's absolutely right. In 1914, early 1915, waves of soldiers came back from the front and they were exhibiting these very strange symptoms, which looked like quote unquote hysteria, which
Mm-hmm.
psychiatrists were um, accustomed to seeing, in women, particularly upper middle class women. So they couldn't quite figure it out. It's a bit like the the neuroscience of concussion and TBI, traumatic brain injury, which is we are in the infancy of understanding that. So they called it shell shock because the initial explanation was, well, it must have been caused by exposure to the shock of exploding shells. And then, of
Hmm.
course, as military psychiatrists realized, no, it's much more complicated than that.
Right.
So it's also worth reminding students that PTSD as a diagnosis, it didn't exist, I think, until 1980. That was a post-Vietnam um, diagnosis that appeared in the DSM, the manual that psychiatrists and doctors use to diagnose, psychological uh, symptoms. So yeah, shell shock. So
Hmm.
I think making these kinds of moves just to remind students a little bit of the historical distance is useful, simply because All Quiet is such a powerful and affecting book. And maybe with that,
Okay.
Richard, we should jump
Well,
in.
let's move ahead. We've got about an hour or so to go.
Wonderful. This is I'm enjoying myself. Um, I, I hope you guys are too. Uh, this little sketch I found here. God bless the internet. So this is the previous map showed you where Ypres was, and you can find lots of other great maps. Sorry, I'm going in the wrong direction. Here's a sketch map. So Remarque was in the uh, Utulst forest in Belgium. This is all Flanders in Belgium. Ypres is here. So the line really on the map runs like this. And of course, the battle was a an Allied offensive that was designed to push forward through the lines. And we see Paul, the battles he's in, most often they're subject to a British attacks and then counterattacks. So he's up in the forest himself, Remarque. So he has a core of combat experience, but the novel, amazingly, like the Red Badge of Courage, I'm not. I mean, this is one way of coming uh, at your question about period fiction or uh, is it period piece or historical fiction that Rashida asked. Um, it's a research novel, remarkable achievement of the imagination. But the research was gleaned from Remarque's his groups of friends. Often they were stories that he heard, I think, first lying there in that military hospital. It's a remarkable feat, but it's worth reminding our students this is not primarily autobiographical, but on the other hand, it's not simply a historical document. Um, I'm not going to dwell on these because I want to get to the book. Here's the cover of the German edition, and I'm going to come back to this German edition, the title, in a moment in one of my first discussion questions for you all. The contemporary reviews in Germany quite interesting. The book is immediately attacked in contradictory ways. On the one hand, political opponents, particularly in the National Socialist Party, the Nazis, are saying, "Look, this is too partial. This is a narrow slice of the war. He's not representative of my war or of our war." Uh, and who's the he? Is it Remarque or Paul? There's very often a confusion of the two. On the other hand, they attack him. So they say it's too much coming from Remarque's own narrow, biased experience. On the other hand, he's also attacked in a contradictory way for not having had enough experience, doesn't know what he's talking about. So just remembering that it was a controversial book. Also, it was received very well, but there was a debate in 1930 in Britain and America about the war novels debate. And lo and behold, the British and American critics decided that their own authors, the victors in the conflict, were much better at representing the conflict than these. I don't have any of these negative reviews here, but when I was researching for this session, very often they would say, criticize the German writing for being too pessimistic or too morbid. So it's remarkable how 1930, 10, 12 years after the end of the conflict, the reception of the book is still getting defined by politics and national identity. Uh, and maybe it's just worth communicating a little bit of that. The fact that this isn't just some, I mean, my my edition has the greatest war novel of all time on the front, which in a way is helpful because it says to our students, pay attention, this is great stuff. On the other hand, you know, that can be a little bit numbing or distancing, I think. So we're just trying to recapture some of that complexity, that life.
Patrick, we have a question here from one of our participants, Jody Hollis. She asked, "Am I reading right?" And on the last slide, did it say that Joyce and Hemingway were at Nazi book burnings?
That's
Their books were burned. They themselves weren't present.
Sorry about that. That's what comes of advancing too rapidly through a slide. Here we are again. Here's the. Thank you for that. No, they were not there. How would they have behaved had they been there? Would Hemingway have leapt into the flames and wrestled the Nazis for the burning books? No, it was that Remarque's books were burned along with 20,000 other books. It's the books of Thomas and Heinrich Mann, Bertolt Brecht, James Joyce, Ernest Hemingway, and Maxim Gorky, and a bunch of other stuff. They were also displaying an exhibition of decadent art, you know, Picasso and other experimental artists. Though interestingly, once the Nazis occupied Europe, they didn't burn the artworks by Picasso. They looted them instead and stashed them away in bunkers and salt mines for their own private collections. So there was a little bit of, cynicism. The books they burned. So, in other words, in a way, Remarque, what is the phrase? Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. Well, maybe getting your books burned by the Nazis is a form of flattery. Yes. He was in good company.
That's a pretty good recommendation, yeah. Okay, shall we move ahead then?
Yeah, absolutely. So here's, if any of you possess either this book or this book, you're in good shape financially. These are the first editions. I wish I did instead of my Ballantine paperback. And here's a poster from the film. I haven't referred much to the film in my presentation. You can readily find the great scenes from the Lewis Milestone film adaptation on YouTube. And I'm going to reference a couple of scenes during my presentation. Suffice to say, yes, I remind my students, it's an adaptation. It's not a substitute for reading the book. But I think it's a particularly fine adaptation. Let me suggest a German counterpart to the Milestone film, which has won a bunch of Oscars, is G.W. Pabst, P-A-B-S-T. He has this remarkable film called, I think it's Westfront, 1917 or 1918. He was an expressionist film director. It is fantastic. It really is, from the German point of view, very claustrophobic, brilliant, closer to Saving Private Ryan than the Milestone adaptation of All Quiet on the Western Front. I'm all in favor of, using film adaptations. I would say the most useful way I've found with my students teaching not just All Quiet but other film adaptations is to use the scene from the film as a lens into doing a compare and contrast with that particular passage of the book, saying here are two different versions of the story. What works better. As I'm going to argue, there's, I think, one scene in the film where the soldiers, you remember the scene where the soldiers debate the causes of war and who benefits from war. I actually think the film does that better than the novel. I mean, that might be, some people may disagree with me, simply because it does it in a more leisurely fashion than Remarque is either willing or able to do in the novel. But, we can come back to that. Also, if you want something to put the cat amongst the pigeons, there is a review by the historian. He's not afraid of controversy, left-wing historian Howard Zinn, Zinn, author of A People's History of the United States. He has a review of Saving Private Ryan, where he, as a veteran of World War II, gets pretty steamed up about Steven Spielberg's 1989 film. And he says, he basically gives a very forcible critique of it. And he says, he uses the film adaptation of All Quiet on the Western Front as his counterexample. This is what a war film should do. Zinn sets the bar high. He wants war films to persuade people not to go to war. But that's a wonderful short reading. Maybe I can put a link up to that on the website.
If you'll send that to us, we can get that up. But we've got about 45 minutes, Patrick. I think we should move on to the interpretation of the novel.
To the real business at hand. So here's my central question, which we've already sort of circled around in different ways. What does All Quiet on the Western Front suggest about the persistence of humanity or heroism in the face of the horrors of war? Of Paul Baumer's, and there's a missing umlaut, sorry, on the A there, those two dots, Baumer's declaration that I believe we are lost. So my keywords there: humanity, heroism, loss, and lostness. And that's actually a photograph. That's what getting wounded spared Remarque. That's the Battle of Passchendaele. You can just see what happened to the trench labyrinth around Ypres because of very heavy summer rains and then just relentless artillery barrages. There's a group of, in fact, British soldiers carrying someone on a stretcher. And in a way, the counterpoint of that visual image, I think using images of propaganda posters, photographs from the front is very useful strategy. I'm kind of suggesting here's a group of soldiers in a moment of solidarity. We don't know who's on the stretcher. They would pull, friends and foe alike out of the mud, get them away from the violence on the front. Okay, so here we go, and let's jump in. Richard, can I ask you, as an excellent reader aloud, just to read these two sentences, which I think we'll all recognise as the epigraph to All Quiet on the Western Front, which was published as Im Westen nichts Neues in 1928, and then translated as All Quiet on the Western Front. So fire away, Richard, please.
This book is to be neither an accusation nor a confession, and least of all an adventure, for death is not an adventure to those who stand face to face with it. I will try simply to tell of a generation of men who, even though they may have escaped its shells, were destroyed by the war.
So I've got a couple of discussion questions here, and these are just my questions. So if our participants, I'm sure, are able to come up with much better questions than I. One thought would be the literal translation of the book's original German title is in the West, nothing new. So, how differently do you think this reads from our perhaps more poetic English translation, All Quiet on the Western Front?
Okay, we've gotten several responses already. For one thing, German is much less romanticized. The chats are coming in. I'm losing track of them here. Let me scroll back. Okay, for one thing, the German is much less romanticized. The English translation is definitely more amenable to the mentioned World War I myth. Same sentiments continue to ring true. German title seems more sarcastic. To answer the first question, I've always heard that the difference comes back to the message that the troops on the front lines would send back to their commanding officers, and then All Quiet reads as more optimistic. Certainly, All Quiet is more lyrical and far less bureaucratic. And I was debating this question, which one is more ironic? I'm not sure, but I think the lyricism and the personal quality of All Quiet makes that a finer title than In the West, Nothing New, but then the author there may have been looking for that impersonal bureaucratic sense. I don't know. And here we have Ryan writes, In the West, Nothing New, maybe clever title for a stalemate. Good point. Both sides could not really get the upper hand. Showing the whole army, not the individual, really shows the individual is not valued. But then for the narrator of this novel, it is all quiet on the Western Front. He dies after all. So I think I think one is more bureaucratic, one more personal, and I think our teachers have offered some really good insights too. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, these are fantastic insights, and I think the point that there is, I guess this was Amelia's point, that there were these formulas that were transmitted in official messages in the West, nothing new, all quiet on the Western Front. So these could be instances of bureaucratic language, but yeah, I mean the German title, the nothing, all that negation, and then nothing new. It's brilliantly ironic, really, since in 1929 there had been a flood of World War One books, and so in a sense it's a power move by Remarque. In the West, nothing new. Actually, you are going to get something new in my novel, and what's new perhaps is the combination of great literature and a book that's eminently readable by a very wide range of popular readership and also by young people as well. Um, uh, there's a double edge to it. And then All Quiet, as you say, I mean, somebody mentioned previously, I would agree, it is more amenable to the mythic version and perhaps a little more sugar quoted. But quietness, I'm haunted by. There's that description later in the book. I'm going to get to it in a few in a few minutes, where Paul this is at the end of chapter 6, right after the pretty stunning description of combat in chapter 6. Paul sort of gets away from the fighting, the narrator, and he tries to recollect his memories. And the memories that come back, he says there are two characteristics of these memories that we all have. Again, it's the collective. One of them is the quietness, you know. So the great German left critic Walter Benjamin, he has this wonderful novel called The Storyteller, and at the beginning of that he talks about how the impact of the technologies of World War One, of total warfare, which would seem pretty rudimentary to us in the era of drone warfare, but we're talking about artillery, machine guns, mustard gas, barbed wire. It caused a generation of men returning to fall quiet, and Benjamin worries about the loss of the art of storytelling. So, I mean, the quiet is, if we push back against that, quite resonant, I think.
Mm-hmm.
the
Patrick,
other, uh,
before we move on, we have two really good comments here that I want to introduce into the conversation. The German title maintains the idea that all is well, which, of course, to those actually fighting and losing close friends, would have been a particularly crushing and ironic statement. And then, all quiet seems much more final. In the West, nothing new seems much more apprehensive, like they're waiting for something to start up again.
right, right, and that's one of those great. Um, that's one of those great sort of tropes of modern literature, waiting
Mm-hmm.
around,
Mm-hmm.
intense anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
Um, those are wonderful, wonderful points. Thank you for those.
We have a little over a
My
half hour to go. Shall we move ahead?
Yeah, let's move ahead. Um, so just the opening, I think it's always, I don't know how you guys feel, but always good to sort of sit down and have the students read aloud the opening of a novel. One thing I would say is All Quiet on the Western Front is rather interesting because, in a way, it's a novel with two different openings. Chapter one opens in this way. Uh, we're at rest 5 miles behind the front. Yesterday we were relieved, and now our bellies are full of beef and haricot beans. So I have a couple of. I'm not going to dwell on this because it's kind of a warm up question. But I often ask my um, since Remarque is so good at appealing to the different senses, not just the visual. Our own war culture, I think, is dominated by the visual. What kind of tone and sensory field does the novel's opening establish? Is it what you would expect from a war narrative? And that's a way just to ask. I like to ask my students, well, what's a war story mean to you? What have you encountered? And often they have very uneven senses of that. And of course, what I tend to say is this is all about the body and it's all about food. And that's kind of a pretty unglamorous way to begin the greatest war novel of all time, to quote that blurb on the front. Um, Again, this first opening of the novel, I'll get to the second one in a minute. The way the friends are introduced is very interesting. In a way, it's worth. I think I'd like to remind my students how kind of formulaic, and it's a mythic in another sort of way. We're used to war narratives, war movies. What's going to happen at the beginning? We will meet the guys in the squad, and there are these various character types. So I think here Remarque's he's drawing on stereotypes. It's very typical, but twisting. I think the novel is brilliant at taking our at the conventions of war narrative, what we expect, and twisting it a little bit. And one thing here we get is a sense of he talks about a generation, but the generation includes, his friend Kat, who is 40 years old and a kind of veteran. Um, uh, I just wanted to draw your attention to the last line. Um, Actually, Richard, could you just read the last, maybe the last three lines, beginning with our gang? Because I just think this is a beautiful moment.
Our gang called the head of the queue before the cookhouse. We were growing impatient for the cook paid no attention to us. Finally, Kaczynski called to him, "Say, Heinrich, open up the soup kitchen. Anyone can see the beans are done." He shook his head sleepily. "You must all be there first." Jaden grinned. "We are all here."
You must all be there first. Jaden grinned. We are all here. I think this is one, here this taps into my question about heroism, persistence of humanity, the lostness. In a way, this is a novel that's saying to us as readers, you must all be there first. This is quite a demanding and disturbing novel to read. I'd forgotten how shocking some of the combat descriptions. So, high school students, even college students, they're not so far apart in age. This can be a difficult book. It's quite demanding. he wants Remarque and also the narrator, Paul, he wants us to be all in a certain sense. And then just Jardin grinned, we are all here. To me, this is the core of the humanity of the book, is it's not I, Paul, am here. We are all here.
Hmm.
There's a sense of, the resources of hope you can find in a collective identity. We are all here. I just think that's a fabulous moment. One question I have, I mean, you'll see my first question is actually quite a leading question. How important are the themes of friendship, comradeship, or male intimacy in the novel? Well, that's a leading question. Obviously, yes, they are important. But then this funny point about um, the status of Paul as narrator again is more complicated than we might think, especially if we begin by reminding our students Paul does not equal Remarque necessarily or in terms of experience. And Paul only mentions his name a few times in the narrative. I say, I don't know if you spotted this, but I think maybe 3 or 4 times only. So the interplay between the we and the I, it's fascinating. There's a kind of collective and sometimes choral aspect that that makes this a different kind of war novel.
Hmm. Hmm. I think before we move ahead, I've got some comments. Some folks have written in here that like to get into the conversation. Jody Hollis writes, the opening establishes the same feeling I get from the things they carried. This aura of stupidity that surrounds the soldiers, this air of difference the war has made on their psyches, and how they are different from people who did not fight it. That will come up later on in our discussion this evening. The first snippet from chapter 1 is also, in a way, about the now. It is written in the present tense to draw attention to that. And then Robert Dominic writes, the contrast is astounding between All Quiet, where they talk about the gang early, and Red Badge, where our first view of Henry is alone in his tent. Going back to that point that I made earlier about how Red Badge is about an individual soldier, and here in this novel and in Things They Carried, you've got groups. And then we have some other comments here. We are all here can bring up the idea of ghosts, though. Very good point. At least the pieces I've read from World War I, they tend to discuss the dead with the living, like they carry the memory. What do you make of
Yes,
that
it's
comment, Patrick?
beautifully stated. I mean, I would connect it. Yeah, the theme of haunting. And I mean, if I'm not, I believe is it at the end of the film adaptation after we see Paul dying on screen as he's reaching out for the butterfly? That's not how the novel ends. Uh, I believe there's a closing shot where we see a kind of ghostly representation of Paul and his comrades kind of marching away from us, and Paul turns and looks to us, the viewer, and there is that. There's a real thematic of ghosts and haunting. It
Mm-hmm.
recurs actually in the British writing of World War II, the Blitz, that I've studied and written about as well. Um, there's so you've got that, yeah, the uncanny, the ghostly. On the other hand, I think the point that was made before about the presentness, a simple point about the narration is that it is narrated in a sort of historic um, present, a continuous present. It's a historic past tense that is just indicating one event after another. So it keeps us as readers, for the most part, in a continuous present, which is a little bit uncanny. It's a little bit ghostly. We don't know what's going to happen next. There are just a few moments when the narration breaks with that.
Mm-hmm.
So, and if I could, Jennifer, just before Amelia made her excellent ghost point, the mentioning the questions that come up when veterans come in and talk to kids. The kids you fear will ask silly questions, sometimes come up with the best ones. I also think that it makes it more real for them. Fantastic point. We need not fear these kinds of discussions. Veterans want to talk, and we as civilians want to know. And I think, in a way, that's why. Well, here's another question. I'm just thinking of that. Is is Paul in some ways childlike as a narrator? Not childish, but childlike. Um, he's very worldly, but the continuous present kind of keeps him in a state of constantly. We get to constantly vicariously experience new sensations through him. It's a very it's a sort of remarkably sophisticated narrative device, I think, that Remarque
Mhm.
is pulling off here.
Mhm.
Um,
Well, we need
Go on.
Patrick, but
Yes,
before we do, let me just introduce these other comments here in
please.
relation to the other questions. The fact that Paul's name is mentioned very rarely, according to Ali, says it adds to the idea of honorable or venerated namelessness, maybe, like the tomb of the unknown warrior.
Unknown.
In my view, perhaps it's better or easier to remember a nameless hero than it is to remember and miss a real person. Um, I think that the themes of friendship and comradeship and male intimacy hold Remarque's ideas of the horrors of war. I think that Devon is suggesting there is that they contain those ideas, how each
Yeah,
one of them are killed. And so, yeah, that makes it really more poignant. I know that final scene where Paul is carrying his dead friend and puts him down, thinking he has saved him, and then discovers that, in fact, an errant piece of shrapnel has killed him. That had me. I mean, that was a poignant scene. And then Devana again clarifies that one by one, ending with Paul. And then let's see, the mention of Paul's name only a few times seems like a calculated decision, as if to indicate how tight knit Paul's group of friends is. They live and die perhaps as a unit, not as individuals. Very good
right.
point.
Yes,
And let's see, lack of individuality is often seen in a negative light, but in this novel it seems to be Paul's only way of surviving. Another good point. And Amelia writes, he always struck me as childlike in the scene when Cat is dying and he describes him as being not being 19 years old and then begs the universe not to let him to die.
these
Yeah,
are
yeah.
so poignant. By the way, the scene in which he carries his friend to the casualty station and doesn't realize that he's already been killed, that's been documented as that is based on Remarque's own experience.
Mm,
I think that happened to him shortly before he himself was wounded. So, um, but it doesn't make it any less poignant if you don't
right.
know that it's autobiographical.
Well, Patrick,
These
we
are
need to move ahead. We've got about 20 minutes or so.
yeah. So, yeah, I put this one in just to give us all a chuckle, because of course we will never let our students down as teachers. Um, but this is just a way, I think, of bringing in the questions. And again, this is part of the mythic version of the war. Um, the motivations for enlisting and serving, bringing up questions of patriotism, authority, propaganda. I'm not going to dwell on this because I do want to get through all the slides. We don't have too much time. Well, you've got a good amount, 22 minutes, I guess, 20 minutes. But a great, I find just showing students some of the propaganda posters from World War One, just showing them a few images, putting them up, in a PowerPoint or on a screen, and having them talk about propaganda. Um, there's a wonderful poster which you may have seen, a British one. Um, what did you do in the war, Daddy? It's where a daughter is asking her father, who's looking rather uncomfortable, while her younger brother is playing with lead soldiers on the carpet. She's looking at a book of maps from the war, perhaps a history book. He's looking a bit uncomfortable. So it's a recruiting poster. Or there's a famous British poster, Women of Britain say go, and there's this heroic view of heroic trio of women sort of sending the men off to battle who are on the other side of a threshold. I'm always really pleased to discover just how good our students are at analyzing, propaganda messages and just commenting on visual images, and it's pretty easy to find posters that counterpoint. The Imperial War Museum has a wonderful collection of propaganda posters. But I'm going to move on from here. I think this is a great quotation. Again, we're still in chapter 1, so we'd better get rolling here. But tremendous articulation of the complexity. Paul's and his friends, their attitude to patriotism, to heroism, to country is complicated. But for all that, we were no mutineers, no deserters, no cowards. They were very free with all these expressions. We loved our country as much as they. We went courageously into every action. But also we distinguished the false from true. We'd suddenly learned to see, and we saw that there was nothing of their world left. We were all at once terribly alone, and alone we must see it through. This tension between aloneness and solidarity, the collective and the individual, and the persistence of there's even in the face of intense irony and disillusion, the valuation of courage. I don't know. Shall we? I think we need to get into the rest of the book. What do you think, Richard?
Yes, we do need to move ahead. Although this was a point that was brought up in connection with Red Badge of Courage, because in that novel, you really have no idea why Henry Fleming is fighting other than for his own personal glory. The words Union, Confederacy, slavery are missing from that novel entirely. There is no overarching political context for that war. It's just, if you didn't know that the uniforms that Henry was wearing, the uniform Henry wore was blue, and the people around him were wearing blue uniforms, you wouldn't know what side he was fighting on. And you don't know, just looking at that novel, you don't know what that war is all about. Completely devoid of this, and actually completely devoid of any larger overarching sense of patriotism. Henry's fighting because he has these images of glory, personal glory for himself.
Absolutely. It's remarkable, the literature of World War One, and All Quiet's no exception. The degree of compassion that is shown, for suffering on both sides. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, in chapter 6, when Paul and his comrades in arms are fighting for survival against the British, intense hatred for an enemy that is subjecting them to this violence. So, it's very, very complex. I think Paul is, he's not a simple modernist outsider. He's both inside and outside the patriotism. Mm-hmm. When the soldiers are debating the causes of the war, one of them says, well, actually, it's better that all of this carnage is happening here in Belgium rather than in our home city in Germany. So, it's very complicated. Mm-hmm. I think a wonderful poem, a companion piece. If I often teach alongside All Quiet and other World War One texts. Some of Siegfried Sassoon's poems. There's a quite a knotty and disturbing one called "The Glory of Women." Where he's displaying real anger, perhaps misplaced anger against civilians and, supposedly callous women on the home front. And there's an image of a German soldier being trod into the mud at the end of that poem, which is very ambiguous. A lot of the time, the war writers feel great solidarity for the enemy soldiers, a few hundred yards away on the other
Hmm.
side of the
Hmm.
lines. And the hatred is often, or the anger is directed back home at a supposedly indifferent civilian home front. Um, on the other hand, you do see this is a war. It's a fight for survival, a fight to the death. Pretty intense stuff. But let me move on. Um, so I mentioned that in a way, All Quiet is a novel with two openings. I think this opening, just going to tap into this one fairly briefly because I just want to move through the rest of my slides if I may. Um, this is a second opening to the book because in a way, if this was a more high literary novel, um, it might begin with Paul as a writer. But look what he's discovering very early in the novel, that the would-be writer, he has the beginning of a play and a bundle of poems in a drawer, um, but he's cut off from the world of literature. Um, and in a way, he's leaving the literary world behind. And we see that again heartbreakingly when he goes home on leave. He sits in his room of books, the books that are the great companions of his childhood and his education. He tries opening a book. His fantasy is of sitting there on leave and reading a book, and it'll just be like old times. And what happens? He cannot read. I mean, we would say, well, obviously, Paul, the print is swimming before your eyes. You've got PTSD, but there's a more profound sense of being cut off from literature, which is, it's powerfully ironic in such a powerful piece of war literature, I think. So this is just a way of saying, in a way, Paul is, um, he's a bluff, no nonsense, ordinary kind of guy. But I think it's good to draw attention to some of the, very literary and skillful narrative techniques that Remarque is using. Supposedly he wrote it, I think, in about 6 weeks, which I have to say makes me feel pretty queasy, given how hard I find writing myself. But there you go. He hammered it out, but it is an intensely and carefully wrought novel. The bit I wanted to get to, the juxtaposition. Do you all remember? I don't. Did you have this experience? I do every time I reread the novel. The boots. So here's Kemmerich lying dying in the hospital because he's been amputated and there's no antibiotics. So all those amputations, it can it can just doom you if you're subject to major surgery. On the other hand, if you get blood poisoning, septicemia, you're also doomed. So they go and see Kemmerich. It's heartbreaking, but part of Remarque's skill is to drop in this. It's not a MacGuffin. It's this motif of the boots, and I find myself, and I worry about this, even as I'm responding to the poignancy of Kemmerich's dying, and that's kind of heartbreaking early on. I'm worrying about the boots. And what does it mean? I have this simple question. Why so much attention to Kemmerich's boots? Why the juxtaposition? And that's also a way of, I think this is one of the primary strategies, the way the novel, what makes it tick, is Remarque is just brilliant at juxtaposing. In this case, poetry, a deathbed scene, and boots. And we learn late in the novel that Paul has already decided who's going to get his boots. So why the emphasis on the boots? I don't know if anyone would like to respond to that briefly.
While we're waiting for comments to come in on that question, Patrick, why don't we move ahead?
Yeah, absolutely. So just a few quick slides now. Uh, Himmeltoss and military discipline. So there's this great. Here's a different kind of modality. A different tonality in the novel. We've got um, beans and bellies. We've got literature. We've got Kemmerich, and then there's the satirical description of Himmeltoss, who's this vicious uh, in charge of their training, horrible guy, uh, who gets his comeuppance when he shows up on the front. And here's this cat saying, well, if you train a dog to eat potatoes and put a piece of meat in front of him, he'll snap at it. It's his nature. It's a pretty bleak vision of war. Is war inevitably a part of our human condition because we're part human, we're part animal? That seems to be the suggestion. Okay, I find that's ripe for a good discussion. But if you just have a look at my first question there, one thing that worries me in the novel, does the beating they give Himmeltoss, you remember they put a pillowcase over his head and give him a real hiding. And then Paul says right after that, Himmeltoss in a way should have been proud of us because we've applied his brutal methods to beating him up. You know, is there the suggestion that this is reducing them to his level? And that's a way in which they are being dehumanized. They are becoming unheroic. They're becoming like him. And in a way, he's not such a bad guy in the end because he is put in charge of the canteen and he gives them extra food. Is that sentimentality? Is that letting Himmeltoss off the hook? Or, is there an acknowledgement that in this kind of environment, the sort of hard and fast distinctions, are really breaking down for Paul's generation?
Mm-hmm.
Shall I move on a bit, Richard?
Yes, let's move on. And I'd just like to make the point that we're going to see that same sort of breakdown of values and morals looking ahead to next week in the things they carried. Now, our question about the boots, we have some really good responses. Amelia Philbrook writes, if I can get that back on my screen here. There's a scene earlier when he describes the boots as drain pipes, and I've always associated them with the draining of life from soldiers. Could go back to the idea that the boots as a physical representation of the lost. The focus on the boots, Ali writes, the focus on the boots seems like a focus on the necessary. Mourning the dead and remembering who used to wear those boots seems superfluous and deadly. Mueller needs the boots. Good boots are scarce. Need overwhelms sentimentality. Ryan writes, soldiers fight on their feet. World War I had a high case of immersion, foot or trench foot, a very painful experience that makes your combat ineffective and the real threat of having your feet amputated. Let's see. Devona writes, she agrees with Amelia. Physically draining the innocence of young soldiers. I also think the boots are treasures in this horrible war. Having the hardware to complete the fight is imperative. And Glenn writes, death is for the dying and boots are practical necessity for the living. Is it that this is something that soldiers are constantly faced with, the possibility of death while also struggling to stay alive? I think they've hit the nail right on the head there. I mean, the people are mourning their friend, but they also are faced with death, and those boots are vital to their existence at this point.
Yeah. And I mean, maybe this is something you can all pick up in terms of the way Tim O'Brien, in such an amazingly poignant way, the things they carried, he keeps returning to things, physical objects, their resonance, and I also think of the objects that people leave, veterans, family members, at the Vietnam War Memorial in DC, which are then archived and put into a warehouse. Those informal memorials that people created after September 11th, 2001. The objects rather than poems and books. These are wonderful comments. I think our students are in good hands, I would say. This slide, one cannot explain it. For your later use, these are just some different literary strategies to describe combat. If you want to get into how it's Remarque is evoking this so powerfully in this verbal medium, the novel. The debate about after the war, the war has ruined us for everything. And then there's this disturbing moment. I'm not going to dwell on it now because we don't have too much time, where Paul says at the end, we are cut off from activity, from striving, from progress. I know, Richard, when we were discussing the novel to prepare for this session, you drew attention to that word being cut off from progress in terms of the lostness of Paul's generation. We believe in such things no longer. We believe in the war. That is a pretty disturbing statement. We believe in the war. I think it's kind of radically ambiguous. I mean, what does that mean? There's no way to rightly answer that question. But a haunting statement. It's worrying.
Mm-hmm.
Paul is worried. Am I ever, even if I survive, can I come back from this? So maybe part of his heroism is just, the belief that may be a possibility.
Right. That also reminded me of the Hemingway story, A Way You'll Never Be, when the soldiers are in the rehabilitation center and they have machines moving their arms and legs and so forth, and they know that they're worthless, and they simply cannot communicate and connect with anybody around them, and it's the only thing that's real to them anymore is the war. Everything else is just show and empty and utterly devoid of meaning. Perhaps that's what he's getting at there, something like that.
Yeah. And I mean, it's it's an intense and kind of absolute statement, whereas our students have been inhabiting a much more blurry sort of environment in which the boundaries between war and peace. I do think when you're teaching war literature, it's good to use the word peace since we hear it so rarely these days. But in a sense, this is one thing that um, we believe in the war. Well, does that mean there can be no post-war? It is, yeah, excellent points. I'm gonna move on just to move through, just give you a sense of some of the uh, hopefully usefulness of some of my other slides, if I may. Um, uh, I think this is a fantastic scene and worth dwelling on. We don't have too much time now. The scene when Cat and Paul roast a goose, just remarkable evocation. If I was asking about the persistence of humanity, what a great scene. It's a moment, as I said, my discussion question of male intimacy. And Paul actually says in 1929, um, I believe we have a more complete communion with one another than even lovers have. The closeness of these men at the front, um, the way that traditional codes of masculinity are getting relaxed or redefined or transformed, uh, and also just the persistence of humanity here. It's a really pretty remarkable passage, and I find my students. It's kind of a relief also from the bleakness of a lot of the other scenes in the novel.
Yeah,
And then I have, yeah,
in our discussion, you made a very interesting point in our preparation for this, that most of the novel is not involved with combat. Most of the novel shows the soldiers away from combat, and there's even a comic element when they're dealing with the prostitutes there, and you've got that they show up at the prostitute's house naked except for their boots, and then they're coming back, and their comrade, when they got drunk and put to sleep, he's running to the house with the women naked in his boots. I mean, there's even a touch of comedy in this novel.
I totally agree, and I mean that's at once necessary for us as readers because otherwise, it would be a bit too relentless. And maybe the post Saving Private Ryan. I saw someone reference Fury. It is something we've um, that there is a tendency to really focus on, the combat at the expense of these other kinds of experiences. Um, but it's true. I mean, when you step back, much of the novel is downtime, and I think it's worth remembering and just asking. I like to ask my students, well, what does it mean, and is there something, in a way, this brings up the question of memory, because when you remember reading All Quiet on the Western Front, you remember it in terms of the combat. But actually, in a certain sense, you even start misremembering your reading experience, given that it's most of the novel is not that intense frontline fighting.
Mm-hmm.
So chapter 6. So I've just got some excerpts from what I think is an incredibly powerful discussion. But even here, I don't know about you all, maybe it's my still, after many years in America, my still English sense of humor in its quirkiness. But when Paul says, he describes responding to this hand-to-hand combat that fills us with ferocity, turns us into thugs, into murderers, into God only knows what devils. If your own father came over with them, you would not hesitate to fling a bomb at him. That is at once terrible, but in the midst of all that darkness, I actually, every time I read that, I kind of chuckle, because it's a terrible kind of humor, but it's a sort of survival mechanism as well. Look, if your dad appeared, you'd throw a bomb at him. And this is how I think that Remarque is an attempt by Remarque just to have Paul push back at the dehumanization. It's a really bravura description of combat. And maybe worthwhile. I think it's also important to ask our students, how they're responding to this, because there are different, and also this is highly gendered. I mean, do the male students respond one way? Do the women respond another way? Well, not necessarily. And I suppose, we also need to be sensitive to the fact that reading an intense description of combat, it is disturbing. So just drawing attention to that. I mean, not to be necessarily squeamish about it, but there might be some students for whom, this is a bit traumatic. So opening up a safe space in the classroom to address that, I think is quite useful. But then again, as someone said in a comment earlier, it may just leave some students cold. They may not respond to it emotionally, and that in itself is worth talking about. There's that debate about desensitization, from video games and war films. This is where in chapter 6 is a very poignant moment where Paul ends up saying, we're forlorn like children, experienced like old men, we're crude and sorrowful and superficial, I believe we're lost. What's the status of that? Is it an ironic statement? I think he's quite sincere at this point. But is he, maybe he says we're no longer untroubled, we're indifferent. Actually, we're not in the hands of an indifferent narrator. So it's possible this might be a moment when Paul is kind of misrepresenting his narrative. Is he an entirely reliable narrator? Can he even fully understand his own experience and its effect on us? Mm-hmm. I would just like to believe. You almost want to say, no, you're not lost, but then in a certain sense they are. They die one after the other. Paul dies at the end. This is sort of terrible loss. Sorry, Richard.
Well, I was just going to say that this contrasts with Red Badge of Courage, because here we don't know what Paul would have thought had he survived, how he would have, as an older man, how he would have reflected upon his experience. We also don't know how Henry Fleming would have reflected upon his experience because the novel ends with him very optimistically marching off to the next battle. The sun is shining, it's coming out. He thinks he's a hero and he thinks he's going to continue to be a hero. So Fleming, dramatizes himself in an optimistic way. He's a young guy. And here, Paul is dramatizing himself in a pessimistic way. He too is also a young guy with very little perspective on his experience as Henry had. So that's an interesting contrast between the way these two novels end. And I think also explains I think the reason for that is the 100 years of difference between Red Badge and All Quiet.
Right, and I'm sort of flash forwarding to the ending of the things they carried,
Mm-hmm.
where O'Brien has his narrator, Tim O'Brien, though he plays around with sort of fictionalization there. He goes back to Vietnam with his daughter on a kind of pilgrimage, which is sort of redemptive for him in a certain way. It's very double-edged, and then it gets even more complicated if we know that actually at the time that he published the things they carried, he didn't actually have a daughter. So the daughter is a fictionalization. So there's this self-representation of Tim O'Brien, the character, which is very double-edged.
Mm-hmm.
So when you say 100 years between the Red Badge of between the you mean in the sense that there's a more ironic consciousness at work.
Right. Yeah. I mean, within those 100 years, you had the war we're talking about. Intervening here. Not.
Yeah.
It wasn't 100 years. Excuse me. It wasn't 100 years between Red Badge and All Quiet. It was 100 years between.
Although it kind of feels
yeah,
like
I know it does. But yeah, it's just interesting that the optimism was still available, or Crane thought it was available. Of course, there's a big debate about whether or not Crane ends that novel ironically, and we don't know what Henry is going to feel after his next battle. But it is interesting that one novel ends on an upbeat note, and this other one here ends on a very downbeat note. Patrick, we're going to have to move ahead here. We've already gone over our time. People, stick with us. We've got some interesting points yet to make.
Okay, yeah, and I'm not going to impose on your time for too much longer, and I'm, tremendously enjoying this exchange with you all. So, I mean, chapter 7, the rather heartbreaking description of his return to his hometown on leave. One difference between the German army and even the British army, where groups of friends, family members were encouraged to join up together in the British regimental system, and that was also there in the U.S. Army. I think in World War One, you had instances of a regiment like the 369th Infantry Regiment, the Harlem Hellfighters, which was a predominant, it was an African American regiment levied from mainly uptown Manhattan in New York City, which went off to great distinction in World War One. That was even more the case in the German army. They really encouraged people to join up from their localities. So there's this intense local knowledge. People really would have, they would serve on the front line with people they'd been to in high school. I mean, it's a remarkable thought. His Paul going back to his hometown, and this is partly autobiographical. Remarque was from this kind of town, Osnabrück, in his case, in Germany. What a heartbreaking moment. My mother is the only one who asks no questions, not so my father. He wants me to tell him about the front. But he discovers that he can't even talk to his father about it. It's not just about a sort of generational thing. I think it's very important to bring up this question about, how do you know, a soldier, veterans talking to civilians. Um, I would do it willingly, but it's too dangerous for me to put these things into words. How poignant then that we as readers are reading a written version of Paul's memories, which he was not able in the fictional frame of All Quiet on the Western Front to convey orally to his father. And then there's also, after this, there's a little bit of comic relief, although it's outrageous. I don't know if you remember, he then goes to have a drink with these school teachers, and there's a headmaster there who's kind of armchair generaling and sort of saying, what we need to do is just roll them up from top to bottom on the front. That's the only way to break through. And Paul Baumer, his former student, dares to say, well, actually, based on my experience, I don't think there's much chance of a breakthrough. Their their logistics, their resources are just too great. We don't have the manpower and the force to do it. They don't have the food that those cans of corned beef. They aren't fed as well. And the headmaster tells him, "Well, what do you know, Paul, as a front soldier? You know, you just have access to the details. You don't have, I think his term is the general survey. You don't have the big picture. You know, that really is characteristic still of our own war culture, where our media or our films give us the sense as civilians that we have a panoramic vision of war. And do we know better than a soldier? It's remarkable how um, vividly, I think, Remarque is conveying this. It's now, we would call it the civilian military divide, but that gulf, the distance, it's really remarkable. Um, but of course, the novel, in a way, is heroic in wanting to overcome that distance. But maybe the poignancy of it, or the irony, is it's Remarque as author speaking to us as reader, but his narrator and all of his friends get sacrificed in the course of the novel in a very ironic way. They do not live to tell the tale. Um, it's pretty poignant.
Patrick,
So
we need to move ahead here. We could proceed on.
yeah, so just follow up to this, the moment where he looks at the books, they don't speak to him, words, 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 they don't reach me. Great moment to ask, and Richard, this is something you brought up in our preparation. Great moment to ask. I like to ask my students, this remind you of anything else? I think you had found echoes in other modern writers. Uh, I think you mentioned Hemingway and James Joyce. So
Mhm.
Remarque again is in good company in literary terms. The Russian POW camp. Why is this in here? Paul's on guard after he's recovering from his. Uh, um, uh, is it before or after he's in the hospital? I think before. The why the Russians? I mean, I sort of like to point my students in this direction. It's another lost generation. It's the dehumanization of prisoners, these scarecrow figures. He offers them half a cigarette. Um, they have it worse even than the German soldiers, and the mark of Paul's persisting humanity is he's able to see that they're even worse off than he is. And I think the the camp that a German writer in 1929, it's kind of prophetic. Maybe this is to read into it too much. I don't know what you think, but you know, um, uh, those other camps in World War II, the Holocaust, other prisoners of war camp, refugee camps now. There's something pretty resonant here and important. The soldiers debate the war. I would just suggest, I will often teach this with the clip from the film. I had mentioned perhaps uncontroversially, that I think the way the film does it is a bit more vivid, because it brings up the film of the economic interests of the war makers and why we keep going to war profiteering some more. Okay, at last we have arrived at the last couple of chapters. Um, I think this is a sort of something happens in chapter 11 where suddenly we notice this change in the narrating voice. It's a little more it's a little more distanced. It's a little more poetic. It's a little more perspective, but that's kind of worrying in a way since we've been so close and so intimate with Paul and his friends up to this point. So I just have this question about, I think there's this wonderful line at the end here about if one wants to appraise it, it is at once heroic and banal. But who wants to do that? This is about the juxtaposition, the proximity of good fellowship, all of these positive experiences of the friends and death and forlornness and isolation, the heroic and the banal. But who wants to do that? So I've just suggested here some other episodes that are both heroic and banal, sort of ironic and sincere. And then, does his distance perspective represent numbness, or, and these aren't mutually exclusive necessarily, or is he reaching some kind of higher state of understanding? I have to say, as I ask that question, I'm a little bit worried about it because there I think we're getting pulled back into the Hemingway-esque myth of war as inspiration, as fodder for artistic creation, or a higher kind of understanding. There's a literary critic who refers to this as combat Gnosticism that we get in some of the great war poets. War as access to higher understanding, and that's a terrible trap, I think potentially. But on the other hand, this is a different kind of Paul by the time we get to the end. And then the ending. I think I always find it good with my students just to read the end. And then, the way we began with that epigraph in which Remarque's, well, who is it? Is it the narrator or it's Remarque, the author, saying this book is to be neither an accusation nor a confession, least of all an adventure? Here we have this funny note right at the end announcing Paul's death in a kind of distant sort of way. What are we to make of this? Really, I guess one large question I would have at the end to pull some of our threads together is, if we've been thinking about the theme of heroism throughout in different ways, or the persistence of humanity, have we seen a redefinition of heroism by the end of the novel, either for Paul and his friends, or for us as readers? I kind of think it depends how how you're reading the novel, how pessimistically or optimistic it seems at the end. And I do have these final questions that I would, and there's a frame from the film of him reaching towards the butterfly. That's not how the novel ends. Um, uh, um, so just some final thoughts, the contrast there. What's happened to our themes of heroism, the persistence of humanity, and then Paul's various assertions that, we're lost, the lost generation. How lost are they? Is their loss our gain, in a sense, as readers? How involved are we as readers in the terrible costs of war that Paul and his friends have? We've seen them having to live and die. Um, so I don't know if anyone would like to jump in with responses to any of these things. What do you think, Richard?
Well, we've come to the end of our time. We've gone a bit over, but anybody have some final comments or questions here that would like to pose? We had a few questions earlier. I don't think we're going to have the time to get to them this evening, but any final questions or comments before we wrap things up? I see some folks are typing in. Let's see what comes over the chat here. But in the meantime, Patrick, let me thank you for giving us a wonderful and rich presentation this evening. Our discussions on this and then our seminar tonight have really illuminated this novel for me, and thank you very much. I appreciate it. It's a wonderful job.
Oh, thank you for inviting me, Richard, and thank you all for just a bunch of really fantastic responses and questions. I mean, I feel like I've really learned a lot. This has been a great experience for me. So thank you all. I hope this has been useful for you all as fellow teachers. I'm actually teaching the second half of All Quiet on the Western Front on Monday, and I feel very lucky to have had this experience. So thank you very much.
Well, Patrick, if you want to use any of the slides from this presentation, you can do that. As our teachers can, ladies and gentlemen. Please go back to the website. The PowerPoint is available there. I know we had to move quickly through some of the slides, but the comments and questions are there, and please feel free to use them in your classes. And please feel free to join us next week, February 4th, for the final installment of our three-part series on teaching war fiction, when we'll look at the things they carried. Thank you for your participation this evening, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you'll be with us again. Good evening.